Alright, so this is my essential Outlast guide for 2024 looking forward. This one will probably not be perfect, but I just want to go over some basic stuff. I mean, basic in a sense that it is slightly advanced. Like, I won't go into really basic shit. I expect you to go through a few trials beforehand and get used to some of the enemies and the items and so on and so forth. But afterwards, this guide is for you if you are struggling and you want to find out some movement text. I did a shitload, and I mean a shitload of A+, no damage, no loadout speedruns in the past, and also quite recently I did a level 1 challenge. And for this level 1 challenge, what carried me through that to get everything A+ consistently, some of these tips really carried me, so I hope they will help you too. Starting off, the most basic movement that everyone agrees on is probably the most crucial and the most helpful is the door snap. Basically, if you're running through a door that is open and you press it at a correct timing, the door closes and you don't lose any momentum, like any at all. This is very helpful because enemies always have door opening animations and stuff, so you can make a shitload of distance for free, literally for free. Especially if you put a shitload of doors behind yourself, the enemy will take a while to catch up to you, even though you don't even physically lock them. They still have to go through them, and with some animations it just takes a while. If you want to practice this, easiest way in the sleep room, the doors. Just try to run at them and, snap at the right moment. It requires a little bit of timing, but it is not hard at all once you get it down a little bit. And afterwards, you will feel so relieved about this tag. Alright, let's talk about sound and hyperfixation. Basically, the way sound in this game works for enemies is obviously they detect you if they hear you running or bashing down or something. If they have some very rough sound effects like seeing you and chasing you, they become focused on only that. So you probably had this situation before where you are getting chased by someone and they might have lost you, and then you want to use a bottle, but they completely ignore the bottle. The reason why this happens is because the enemy still is focused on you. You will have to wait in that scenario until the enemy moves again and starts searching for you and entering the search state. Then you can use distractions. But on the other hand, this also works for bottles, this hyperfixation, or for using the stun rig as a sound device, that is. So basically what you do is you use a bottle, they hear it, and while they're walking towards the bottle, they are hyperfixated on the bottle in the same way they are hyperfixated on you when they were chasing you. So what you can then do is get away with noise. For example, bashing down a crucial door, and they will not care about the door whatsoever at all. Another good example is right here in Snitch. I threw the bottle there, and what happened is, you see that giant that is even in the room with us? He completely ignores that I touched the switch and goes checking out the bottle because he gets hyperfixated on the bottle itself. Very useful once you know how it actually pays out and can save you a lot of time in some instances. For tip number 3, it's very casual. Darkness is your best friend, except for Night Hunter, then it reverses itself. But darkness is at this point almost overpowered, but it's just a core game mechanic. If you go into darkness, enemy loses you immediately or, very easily and start going into the search mode really quickly. Especially if you then stop moving and making any noise, they will go search around and you are pretty much safe from the get-go. This is very important, especially if you don't have that much stamina yet, because you don't have the stamina prescriptions. You then start looking at maps and see darkness as checkpoints. So essentially you have a bunch of checkpoints. Best example probably would be Sabo Lockdown, because if you're a new player, you don't have the prescriptions for stamina, you don't have the prescriptions for the carry object, let's say, and obviously you are very vulnerable. So what you do in Sabo Lockdown, besides going an optimal path, which I'm not gonna bore you with, you go from darkness to darkness, ideally, and treat light as a really vulnerable place, because it is. But for example, here it's a dark room, it's really nice, you chill here. Then the bathroom adjacent to it, okay, this is pretty right. I need to get to there ASAP, essentially, because there, right over there, is another darkness room. I need to get to the checkpoint, and once I am in the darkness checkpoint, it's fine again. Now here, it's another hallway that's pretty bright. Okay, this is kind of bad. I need to get, ideally, to the shooting range, because the shooting range is dark again. So in a lot of trials, it's very good to get to these checkpoints, especially with like heavy objects and so on and so forth, if you are struggling. Alright, let's talk about doors, door locks, and rigged doors, all that jazz. Now, unreliable doors is quite a pain in the ass if you're still starting out, but once you get the prescriptions to knock down in 2 hits and not getting exhausted and whatever, it is pretty negligible. And door locks can be really helpful in some scenarios, because yes, big enemies knock down doors really easily, and prime assets as well, but small enemies don't, like Night Hunter, the normal grunts, hiding spot people, the witness, screamers as well. Especially the last 3 that I mentioned, they can't even open door locks even if they are on the same side. So you can do some advanced shit like locking witness in, for example. But essentially the bottom line of this is they will take a while to knock down doors. So if you are being pursued and you lock a door, you can do so much distance for free. And even advanced players I see not utilize this feature enough. Especially if you can circle around, so you have someone knocking down a door, but once they are locked in the knockdown door animation, they cannot cancel it. So you can bait someone in breaking down a door, or it also works for barricade essentially, it's the same thing. And then literally run past them, because they cannot cancel the animation. And you get so much distance for free and position yourself better in case you need it. For rigged doors, I mean, you probably have seen it at some point. Obviously, you can open doors slowly, but you can also just crouch and then the cross thing will just fly over you. And that's that dealt with. In general, rigged doors are not that threatening, especially if you get the prescription level 3, which, you know, lets you grab free from the trap faster if you're getting caught. And essentially in some of the maps, if you get unreliable doors, one way to get through that variator, for example, let's say in Vindicate the Guilty, if you have to get the acid, for example, one way to get through that trial the best you can, if you have unreliable doors, is check for rigged doors, because obviously rigged doors are open, and barricaded doors and shit you will have to break down. So if you have a room and you know the acid is in there, it might be worth to check if you have a door that is blocked. Okay, can I enter from another side? It's just if you are still, again, if you still don't have the prescriptions, again, this is mostly beginner friendly, then check for the rigged doors. They're literally your friend in some of these scenarios, because they're just really easy to deal with, and you can just enter rooms for free this way. Next tip is a little bit of a small one and a bit of a weird one, but basically special enemies have some boundaries set to them. For example, hiding spot people and screamers. I don't know what actually triggers that, I will have to admit, but if you harass them more than enough, they will actually leave the area. So if you trigger a screamer by screaming a shitload of times, then at some point they will leave through the shuttle. So if you're struggling in a specific segment, for example orphanage basement, you can just trigger him over and over again, and at some point he will leave. The same goes for Night Hunter and Berserker. I mean, not the same goes, but they also have special boundaries that they're bound to specific places, especially the Berserker. For example, in Vindicate the Guilty, he will always stay in the lobby, and once you get away from the lobby, he cannot follow you, really. He just cannot follow you. Same with, for example, in Feed the Children, an orphanage. he can also not follow you inside the orphanage. Like, he will chill outside the chapel, but he cannot follow you inside you directly. So you just know after a while which spots they cannot follow you in. It's a bit more annoying for Night Hunter because previously you were able to easily just, for example, get him up to the chapel, and why this is somewhat technically possible, it's just way more tedious right now. Also, one thing that's really important about enemy boundaries, ever since update 4, enemies actually respawn more likely where they are supposed to be. So if you lure, for example, a guy in Vindicate the Guilty again, I'm just gonna use that example. You lure the small guy from the acid room downstairs, and he will lose you. He will go ahead and go to the next enemy shuttle and respawn upstairs. So it's a lot more tricky to get it. Obviously, if you're playing multiplayer, which I'm not really taking into account for this video, then it's obviously easier to just kite the enemies when someone kites them and the other person does the objectives, but this is important for solo play. Number 6 is a little bit of a pussy tip, but if everything breaks and you don't know further, careful stealth pays off. If you have someone chasing you, and again, as I mentioned earlier, in darkness, they lose you very quickly, what you then do, you just chill. You literally just chill. That's one of the main key factors how I beat the level 1 challenge. You just chill, they will check some hiding spots, but the main key component is, at some point, they go back into the default patrolling stage. Like, this game, unlike other stealth games, doesn't have enemies in a stage where, okay, they have seen you and they are now constant paranoid for the rest of the trial. There's no factor like that. If you're just chilling out and at some point they reach patrol stage again, then you are golden again and good to go again, and you completely reset. So if it ever gets really tricky, just go ahead and play careful for just a second, even though it might get tedious and boring. Okay, even though we just talked about careful and shit like that, the next tip is kind of contradicting, but respect enemies when needed, but disrespect when you don't need to respect them. This sounds pretty weird, but enemies are always tied to their movement speed, and there's also a hidden stamina meter for a lot of enemies. You probably realized how sometimes enemies follow you and then all of a sudden they stop and they get slower until they get faster again. I'm pretty sure it's because of a hidden stamina meter. And basically what I want to say with that tip is, some sections are really tedious to play, especially solo, especially without any loadout, which is also what this guide kinda caters to. For example, the push the boat segment in Grind the Bad Apples, after you disarm the first barricade, and then you have the small guy and the big guy patrolling. So, for example, in this segment, I had it multiple times where I knew, okay, I distracted them maybe with hyperfixation a little bit, and then they saw me. But I knew, because they were far away from me and it took a while to catch up to me, I could go away with pushing the boat all the way to the checkpoint before they could get to me. This is definitely something where you will have to experiment a little bit with, and there's no shame in doing so. And, you know, figuring out, okay, how fast are they actually? Because also another thing, this is as a side note, but enemies often sound way louder, even though they are not that close to you, which I think is because the developers just wanted to add a little bit of the horror factor to the game. But yeah, essentially, some objectives are tedious. There are a lot of objectives where you can take a few shortcuts if you just quote-unquote man up and just, you know, greed it, and, you know, you can get away with it. Because right now, as I'm doing this video, there are no ranged enemies. This will probably change in the future, but for now, you can get away with a lot of shit like this, even on higher difficulties. Now there are various other miscellaneous movement tags. For example, credits to SAS. I'm gonna leave the SAS tag right there, where you basically slide on the surface and basically skip going down, and you know, other shit like that. One I want to highlight, which is maybe interesting, is I call it window tag, but you probably should more call it vault tag. No intention in Fallout reference, by the way. But basically, if an enemy vaults into you, and you vault into the enemy, you take no damage. That's the core concept. Now in update 4 that changed a little bit because they did some weird movements and you are most likely to get hit somehow if you keep abusing this. But if the vault is adjacent to darkness, then it's a lot easier to still pull off. So if you lure an enemy, for example, ending of Vindicate the Guilty again, you vault, the enemy follows you and vaults into the dark because they don't really see you directly. They will go ahead and not attack you. You vault into them and go to victory. There are some spots where you can still do that, and that's maybe something to keep in mind, that window tagging still exists, but just be very careful with that because ever since update 4 and they added tracking hits and all that stuff, it's a lot less reliable. Still good to keep in mind. Speaking about tracking hits, let's talk about dodging, which got a lot more difficult with the last update with the tracking hits and so on and so forth. I made a video about that recently. And yeah, essentially they track and predict hits, but you can also abuse that pretty hard. So there are two things that you can reliably do to dodge most enemies. For one, you can put an object right between you and the enemy, and if they want to attack with a launch attack, you can make them choke on the object itself. It's pretty easy to do, you just need to know spots where you can actually do that. And then there's another trick that you can use, and that works on a shitload of enemies, surprisingly, is basically run into the enemy and do a circle around, because that baits a lot of enemies in doing short attacks. This works really well for small grunts. For big ones, the axe guys, it works too, but you don't get that much value out of it. Like they will probably attack immediately afterwards, so it's not really that useful there, but it's still good to know in emergencies. It does not work on the berserkers. And regarding Prime Acid, it does work pretty well on Gooseberry. It's very abusable. On Coil, it also works, but it is very iffy and tricky to actually pull off. And again, you have to time that perfectly to also make a play and go afterwards, like, you know, squeeze by afterwards. You can also do the thing where you essentially bait out a lunge and then do the same thing with the door snapping and get them into the room. That also works pretty well. It's also really risky to use though. And there are also some other baits you can do. For example, you can position yourself quote unquote poorly to the side to bait out a launch attack that they do a weird spin all of a sudden, or, you know, aim really badly in advance to cut the launch short, and then you can step dodge backwards. I will do a more in-depth dodge guide once I learned more about it. Again, this is a field I learned a lot about recently. I haven't looked into that much yet, but keep an eye out for that. I really want to do that, and you will see that up in the corner once I release the dodge guide. And last but not least, to conclude this for now, I just want to look at A+ grading, because a lot of people still don't know how the grading system works. Essentially, you see all these points, the positives that are in black and the ones that are in red. Red ones obviously take away from the grade, so if you take damage, you step on sound traps, you lose psychosis, you die, and so on and so forth. That obviously negates the grade. And then you have the black points above that essentially boost your grade. And you can do something that I call evening out your grade. So if you take, for example, damage, and you do a shitload of good actions like they are listed above. For example, you use a shitload of items, you use hiding spots well, you headshot enemies, you stun enemies in general, you distract enemies, you use your wig, you do all that shit, you can even out your grade. And even though you took a little bit of damage here and there and sound traps here and there, you can even out your grade and still get an A+. Even, I mean, A+ is a bit more specific because you kinda need to get the posters, but technically you also don't, because it is possible to get A+ by just evening out your grade over and over and over again without getting the posters, but it's a long ass process. But yeah, essentially, as long as you do positive actions, you can even out a lot of negative ones. It's obviously harder for some rather than other ones, like if you die, then that's already pretty hefty, but technically you can farm a lot to even out psychosis or normal hits, for example. And that's it for, in my opinion, the Essential Guide. I might have missed something very, very obvious. Let me know in the comments. But this is mostly catered towards newer players, also solo, also no loadout kind of stuff. So I hope this was helpful. If it was and you enjoyed the video, make sure to drop a like and subscribe for more Outlast Trials content in the near future. And make sure to share the video around with people who might find this interesting. It would mean the world to me and hopefully help them as well. And yeah, I hope I get the other guides for the map specific ones out soon. I don't know how long that will take though. It might take a while and be a process because I want to do them properly, but yeah, we will see. Thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day and take care everyone. Bye bye.